Hello everybody, in this video today I'm going to be answering the question, what is the difference between a tic and a Tourettic OCD compulsion? Now, I've had this question asked a couple of times, so I thought it would be good to make a video about, but before I get into that I actually need to clarify first of all the difference between Tourettic OCD and Classic OCD. Classic OCD is what most people are referring to when they say OCD. It's where a person has rituals and compulsions which can be mental or physical that are fueled by fear, anxiety, worries and intrusive thoughts. Tourettic OCD, on the other hand, is where a person has rituals which look just like the rituals in Classic OCD, but rather than being fueled by anxiety, intrusive thoughts, fears or worries, they are fueled by physical sensations, premonitory urges, just like tics are. And in some cases, these Tourettic OCD compulsions can be fueled by out-of-body sensations, phantom tics. So I would say the first difference between a tic and a Tourettic OCD ritual is that Tourettic OCD rituals look more like the Classic OCD rituals, and from the outside a person would think it's OCD and they wouldn't automatically think it's tic-like. So for example, a person with Tourettic OCD could have hand-washing rituals, but rather than being done because a person's worried about germs, they may be done just because a person feels a sensation on their hands and they feel like they have to do it. But when you see someone washing their hands for ages, you're not going to think that's a tic, you're probably going to think OCD first of all. So Tourettic OCD really is where it looks like you have OCD rituals, but they are more tic-like in the sense that they are fueled by physical sensations and not anything mental or emotional. Now, it is possible to have ritualistic tics as well. For example, I had one when I was younger where I would clap, do this, tap my thigh and do other stuff as well, and that was a tic with multiple parts, but it still didn't resemble an OCD compulsion as such. The Tourettic OCD rituals can look very stereotypical, very OCD-like. So for example, straightening things can also be a Tourettic OCD compulsion, but rather than being done due to anxiety, it could be done because a person feels like there's a sort of sensation around the pens or whatever they're straightening, and that's really, really uncomfortable, and they need to put it in a certain place so that it physically feels better. Again, looks very OCD-like. People wouldn't usually think of that as a tic, but the fueling source is different to what fuels Classic OCD rituals. But because Tourettic OCD is really kind of a weird mix between tics and OCD, of course there are similarities. Bamboo. One of the similarities is the way it's managed. Tourettic OCD is different from Classic OCD in that the interventions typically used for Classic OCD are CBT with ERP and sometimes antidepressant medications, but with Tourettic OCD, it's often managed more like tics. So for example, for me, antidepressant medication didn't really help, but antipsychotic medication did. And this is because antipsychotic medication is sometimes used for tics. Another similarity is that, unfortunately, when a person suppresses their tics, they can sometimes trigger other issues. So if you're suppressing your tics, you may have more rage attacks. With Tourettic OCD, that can also happen. You may try and resist the rituals and ERP, but then end up having rage attacks instead, and then it triggers another issue, and it can be extremely frustrating. The main difference is really just how complex the rituals are and how much they resemble Classic OCD. And for example, a person with Tourettic OCD may also have rituals where they go 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, and do things in threes. That's very obsessive. People wouldn't usually see that as a tic, but a person may not be doing it due to anxiety in Tourettic OCD, they may be doing it due to a physical urge. As well as this, there are some tics which occur more in one environment or could be triggered by one environment, but tics are usually something that will happen kind of randomly. For example, when I say bramble-bush as a tic, it can happen anywhere at any time. But with a Tourettic OCD ritual, they're kind of set in some ways. So it might be that every time you walk into a room, you have to flick the light switch on and off quite a lot of times. And that, again, isn't quite random because you know that you're going to do it whenever you walk into the room. It's kind of set, it's kind of rigid, very obsessive in that way, but the fuel isn't anxiety, it's a physical sensation. Again, if you're dressing yourself, you may bramble-bush have to click your shirt quite a lot before you put it on, and that can be very, very time consuming. Some people may do things for 40 minutes or a few hours, and that usually isn't seen as a tic because a tic is usually seen as something that's quick, although not necessarily, because there is such thing as dystonic tics where sometimes your tic might kind of hold itself in place for a while. I had an arm one where My arm wasn't locked, but my muscles were tensed up and it wasn't very nice. So some tics can be longer, but you know, they usually aren't Bramblebush. Most of the time they aren't hours, and sometimes the rituals can be. Sometimes the Tourettic OCD rituals can just keep doing something like flicking a light switch on and off, or drying your hands for hours, and that can be very time consuming, whereas tics are usually said to be quite quick. So despite the fuel being the same, as in both tics and Tourettic OCD rituals are fueled by premonitory sensations, the way they look is sort of different, because when a person sees Tourettic OCD from the outside, they're just going to think OCD. For example, when I was younger, I had a ritual where I would like just come in and straighten my shoes for hours, and that wouldn't be seen as a tic. Like, people wouldn't think that straightening something is a tic, that's more OCD. Tourettic OCD does have a bit of an obsessive element, because there can be the fixation with certain numbers or doing things in a certain way, but again, not due to anxiety or an intrusive thought. And tics usually don't have this obsessive nature most of the time, although they can do in some cases. Sometimes people will have a Tourettic OCD element to their tics where they have to do a tic a certain number of times, or have to do it on the other side to make it symmetrical. It mixes together. It is quite hard to explain, because if it's a mix between tics and OCD, they're going to have similarities to both tics and OCD. It's really just where it merges together and creates its own weird sort of entity. So in conclusion, I would say the differences are that the Tourettic OCD rituals are often quite rigid and may occur when you're doing a specific thing. So like flicking your light switch anytime you go into your room, or clicking your clothes whenever you're dressing yourselves, whereas a tic may happen quite randomly at any time. Tourettic OCD rituals can have an obsessive element, such as counting or straightening things, having things to be symmetrical, but then you can have tics that have a Tourettic OCD element where you do that with your tics as well. Tourettic OCD rituals usually look more like classic OCD from the outside, but the fuel is similar to that of the fuel of tics.